welcome. We are starting the webinar today, and my name is Marcia Warren Edelman. I'm a body psychotherapist practicing here in Boulder, Colorado, and I am happy to be doing this webinar with my colleague.
I'm Philip Horner. I'm also a licensed clinical social worker here, also practicing therapy, and I do a lot of groups. That's how I usually do these kind of conversations. And we're excited to have a chance to talk to you about just the process of talking about race and culture and connection and all the things that come up, and hoping to demonstrate some of those own difficulties as we sit here and do it together. And hopefully we can answer some questions as they come up for all of you.
And this webinar really came from our own conversations, both as practitioners and colleagues. We found that really starting on an interpersonal level, a one-on-one level, allowed us the ability to explore not only our own locations and our own cultures and identities, but really the dynamic between us, some of the assumptions that we might hold about each other, and really take the time to start kind of deconstructing what seems to be a default way of communicating around race these days, which is very, very quick, very fast, but also not with a lot of ability to form relationship and connection around the topic. And at least from my perspective, and I think Philip shares this too, is that there's a lot to be said for giving yourself the time and space to build relationship in order to gain new knowledge, and really bring a different perspective on the issue of race and culture in this country. And I would say even as we see around the world today, I think there's a lot of desire on people's parts to understand and a lot of fear on how do I actually get to that understanding. So what we hope to do today is actually start off with maybe a couple big questions that we can pose to each other. And for those of you that are joining us today, for you to ponder as well as how it affects you all in your relationships, in your work life, and also your personal lives, and offer your thoughts and your questions as we go along. And we'll be checking in with questions as we go through this next hour together.
Yeah, we expect there to be many questions. So if we don't get to yours, we apologize. What we really want a lot is for you all to witness a conversation about race, as I identify as a white person. Marcia?
Yeah, well, this is one of the first things we started talking about is, and I'm sure many of you will resonate with this, the whole idea of identifying oneself, right? And a lot of times when I work in trainings or I'm working with groups or my individual clients, for me it's about choice. Really the context in which I identify myself as a person of color, in what way do I identify myself, and how different it is between identifying oneself in terms of race versus culture. So I'm just going to provide my own example of the two different ways that I've found myself struggling with this, because for me, I'm multicultural, so I have many different identities, and it ends up being a very long hyphenated description of who I am. But if I were to identify myself as race, at least in the context of the United States, I would say I'm a person of color. And that, I think, is a very, it's a simple explanation, but it also doesn't give a lot of depth to who I am as a person. So if I were to say who I am culturally, I would identify myself as an enrolled member of Santa Clara Pueblo in northern New Mexico, the daughter of a Brazilian immigrant, and I hold very close ties to both of those cultures, both Native American and Brazilian. Grew up in New Mexico, which is its own culture within the United States, very different history. And then my own culture that I feel that I've come to embrace, which is being multicultural, and that's a very different place to be, I think, in this country. So as you can hear, that's a much longer conversation to have. But I think it also affords some kind of entry point for people to ask me about that, if that's where I'm willing to go.
Well, I think this is a great place for us to just have our conversation together and let them witness it. Because I was, as you were saying it, I just realized that I introduced myself as I'm a white person, and that's it, and that lacks the ability to identify more. And like hearing you go into depth just also lets me know, like, wow, I don't always think about all the aspects of who I am, the identity and the cultural parts of myself when thinking about that. And I think that has to do a lot about how many people, and I don't want to name all white people, but I think that does occur for a lot of white people where we might not think about those other aspects. It might not be something you have to think about.
Yeah.
So I was noticing as you were saying that, just thinking, huh, my description was so short, and I'm glad I just left it to be like, and Marcia, letting you go with it, rather than identifying you as whatever I might have said before.
Yeah.
But
or even that dreaded question of, so what are you?
Yeah.
Well, and I wonder too, because you're saying that you would identify yourself as, I'm a white person, but does that really happen in day-to-day life? I don't think I've ever been with, folks that are white that say, oh, I'm a white person. It's usually, I'm from X town in the United States, or I'm from, there's rarely sort of that descriptive piece to it. And I guess my assumption is that there is a shared knowledge of what being white is.
Yeah.
And so, does that come up for you?
It's a great question. I think I would say that I don't think there's a shared description of what being white is. I think most white people aren't asked that question. I think that I rarely get, other than the conversations I get to have with you and other colleagues. And I don't get those questions of like, what are you, or where are you from, or what's that accent from, or those sort of things. And I think that there is more culture if we look at it, but you're right. I think it's very rare someone comes on and like, identify as a white person. Like, if I went into it, I could start talking about where I'm from Durham, North Carolina, and that might mean something. Or where my family origins are from, or what I learned from graduate school when I looked at my family history, which was shocking to learn all about how much my family was involved in slaves and how much they were part of the colonization and things like that. That was kind of scary to learn. Yeah, I think you're right. I think when people ask to identify, it's very rare. As much as like education through my social work program is like, okay, here are all the things you're identifying to know about your privileges. But I think what's so much important is thinking about what is lost too, by just saying I'm a white person. What does that even mean?
Yeah, I'm really curious about that, because that's come up, I think, in some groups that I've been in, where we've made that distinction between race and culture. And when we talk about cultural identity, and this is a group of both, people of color and white folks, there's a theme of loss that happens around the room. I would say from the people of color, a lot of it is, and I hold this too, is the loss of ability to be fully within the culture that I'm affiliated with, whether that means losing the language, losing the traditions, because of colonization, because of immigration, because of the push for assimilation into what we would call a dominant culture, right? So a lot of loss around identity and affiliation, right? But I was really surprised, I think, from also that same example of what some of the white folks were bringing to it. And they had done some genealogy work and some immigration histories. And some just like a loss in terms of a depth of knowledge. And in some cases, just not even knowing, what they gave up in order to be part of. Yeah. And it made me sad that there's such a shared loss.
Yeah.
But also curious about why don't we go there in those discussions? This is not even knowing, so what they gave it. And I'm, and I don't want to discount really where we all are at this point in terms of kind of this I'm going to say reawakening of identity. I think it's so important to have our voices as communities, especially for marginalized communities, to be standing proud and standing separate in a way of saying, okay, this is who we are and this is what we're trying to reclaim. But I also want to create that bridge too of understanding that there were so many waves of immigration into this country where people were asked to give up, themselves, their identities in order to access whatever, the power structure as it was defined was.
I want to respond to this conversation, just like what's coming up, what I'm feeling. And I'm noticing, thinking about, I went from several things of thinking of like early colonizers coming, or the Irish coming, or Italians coming, losing their last names and everything. And I'm also thinking about maybe more stereotypical white people who might not think anything about this, not even like what you're talking about. I think even for myself, sometimes like, oh, right, what have I lost? What pieces? And I don't think that's something that's really normal. And I think I think is a huge loss. I think particularly for, at least in my experience, for white people, is this loss of that culture, a loss of their culture as well, as you're talking about loss of culture, and becoming acclimated with just everything else rather than whatever they're growing up with. And I wonder about that. I think about that. Why is that?
Yeah. And I mean, I have a question for you. Do you think that feeling of like not knowing, or maybe a sense of loss around it, prevents perhaps the curiosity about other culture, and that it's gone into like the default of cultural appropriation, perhaps?
That's a good question. I think I can only talk for myself. I think growing up without knowing a lot about that, yeah, I think in some ways maybe there's less curiosity, and there was a lot of acceptance, but not a lot of always desires to learn more. I was always a very interpersonal child. I grew up a very sensitive kid. Really wanted to connect, like we're doing here. Like this is wonderful to me. And I think getting beyond that was sometimes a lot. I still remember, speaking of cultures, this breaks away from a little bit, but not totally, because I think Judaism and race do get this mix sometimes, particularly when we talk about racism. When I took a Holocaust class in high school, I remember being very involved and really engaged with it and writing. And I remember my teacher even, I think at that time they sent things home to your parents to be like, Philip's doing really well. And then there was one day I stopped writing. And I think I was starting to feel very depressed learning about all this. And it was really hard to continue. And I think looking back on it, there was knowledge that I didn't have to, because it wasn't my culture. And I feel guilty even thinking about that, and I know we're trying to be very vulnerable here. So I feel that vulnerability sharing that a bit. And so I think there might be less curiosity, and the appropriation, I think, it comes in partially because there isn't anything else known. Like that's what's known when you growing up. Like, this is that and that is this.
Yeah, and I think as you say that, it makes me feel really sad.
Yeah.
Because I think one of my difficulties is that as I talk about being Native in particular, and actually my husband and his family is Jewish, and his grandparents were Holocaust survivors. Yeah. There is such a presence of intergenerational trauma, that really it's, I want to share that with people that I'm close to, and I do feel that sense of like, like they can't breathe around it, because there's a feeling of I have to do something, and really I don't want them to do anything. I just want them to hear it.
Yeah.
And I feel like I want the space, as a Native woman, to be able to be in my culture, in my own grapplings with what does that mean and that identity, but also be able to share that history without having the stereotypes that come with that, or even the discomfort. I think it's more the discomfort, because the discomfort then promotes kind of the next few questions. I mean, I've had interactions where just the most inappropriate stuff comes out from that, like, oh yeah, I'd had ancestors that, fought over an Indian princess, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, I don't understand what,
why
are you telling me this? And I think it's an attempt at trying to connect, but on such a missed level that it's like, I have no idea what to do with that. So it's, I guess, in the spirit of like actually saying what I need around that is and I'm not going to stay in person of color, umbrella, but kind of as a Native woman, it's like, just be with that with me. And I don't feel the need to like explain it or try to find something that's, beyond just the interpersonal piece of it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Be curious about it, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know why we don't need many questions. As much as we're open to Q&A, always, I'm finding so many things for myself coming up as you're sharing, and like I'm wondering like which directions, things I want to share with you, and I'm noticing myself thinking, hearing that and feeling the frustration and also your pain with that, and particularly about like people trying to connect and missing it, and I think about myself and how have I connected with different cultures and people of different racial backgrounds, and I don't have a real answer. I don't think I have any secret answer. I think I value connection so much, and we've talked about this before about one of the reasons I've gotten so much more involved in talking about the white consciousness and understanding white racial identity development is thinking about the large loss that I think everyone's incorporating. And I know white people may not know that. I shouldn't say for all white people, but I will say for myself and the other white people I have worked with and talked to, is there's a loss because there's almost these two complete different worlds just walking past each other and avoiding conversations that are allowing them to get closer and having that intimacy. Yeah. And something, I pride, in my work about connection. And I see that with racism. Yeah. Like it's this giant divide that people don't want to talk about it. And I guess there's a lot of defense that comes up and thoughts, at least that's what I see from the white perspective. And I think in doing so, I know some of the big reasons are the fears of called out or making a mistake. Yeah. And wanting to show that we're aware or correct. And God, I know I make mistakes constantly. I value when you let me know of something, or I think it was earlier you laughed about something that I was all worried about. Yeah. But and I took that as wholeheartedly warm. I didn't feel pushed away. But so I noticed those even, and I think probably people trying to connect and not doing it because they're like, oh, I'm gonna do something wrong. Yeah. I think that comes a little bit with because I've done a lot of social justice work, and there's a lot of importance, and rightly so, placed on languaging, right? Yeah. So, and we have a great paradigm for that. I mean, it's necessary to have the language in order to describe our experience, and it's a double-edged sword because I think then there comes that fear, even from my side, of am I using the right language? Am I saying it in the right way? And that unfortunately taps into sort of this, very not limiting, but very kind of tight place for me, of like, I don't want to mess up. I don't want to mess up. Even when I'm working with other people of color, it's like, okay, I want to make sure that I'm doing everything correctly, not asking for identity before someone's ready to share that, or, it just feels very, tight, I think is probably the best word for me. And I'm putting myself in those situations all the time. I mean, that's my life. I love to do that. That's my focus for my practice is working with multicultural individuals with race and culture, and identity and all that. So I'm willingly putting myself in there, but I'm finding myself in a place where it's like the languaging is kind of taking over the interaction. And I have a desire to really just get to know people where they're at in that moment. And so it feels like two different things are going on in my head. It's like a lot of thinking, but also that kind of that heart connection that I want to have as well. So I guess sort of that's where I make that distinction between talking about race and culture, because culture feels like to me a little bit more encompassing of a totality of experience. And race is definitely part of that. Yeah. But I do notice that with you a lot when we're talking. It's like culture, and I'm like, right. And I've been so ingrained to be like race. Look at race. Yeah. And not in a bad way. Like to the audience, my ingrained part is not so much like I've been like punish, but like to look at my race and look at the racism that's happening, and the workshops I've done, you know, focused on race more than the culture. And so I've appreciated that with you. It's been this like different thing that I'm like always wrapping my head around, like trying to get to understand definitions the right way, and I'm always like, how do I even say this, and how do I ask this question? Because it's like a different, it's almost a new conversation than the ones I've been having, like at AGPA or with my colleagues in New York, or with like our colleague Marseille that we're going to work with. And I think that it's great because it's leaving me like, I'm what, like lost of those words. Like what do I spit out now?
Well, I mean,
and listen more.
Yeah, well, and it goes back to, you know, sort of my deep assumption that because I live in this place of race and culture, that of course everybody does. So like my assumption of like in talking to you, you know, and there was that, I think we had that conversation recently about, well, yeah, of course there's a white culture, you know, and you're like,
I was like,
you know, so I mean, you know, I'm putting together concepts that are so familiar to me. So, you know, I appreciated the reflection from you. That's like, no, there is no white culture.
There's no one.
There's no one white culture, right? And that's sort of, that's what's been ingrained in me in talking about dominant culture, right?
Yeah.
That's where that languaging I think is so powerful. And I may be offering this to our, you know, to our viewers, to the participants today, is, you know, how powerful languaging can be to define something, but also where are the limitations for that, you know? So dominant culture, you know, takes away sort of the subtleties of where we can enter into different kind of conversations with people, perhaps, and what dominant culture means in different places. You know, this was the other conversation we're having. Being from New Mexico, our dominant culture was not white.
Yeah.
You know, it's Spanish.
Yeah.
And there's a whole bunch of stuff going on with that right now that's being re-examined. So, you know, another level of assumption there.
You know, it's funny to think about that. I'm like looking back, like, okay, well, when did I start to learn and talk about race? When did I start to think about culture? And I probably thought about culture earlier on. I'll give some credit to my family. I come from a family psychologist, so that might have some judgments in it. But, you know, we thought a lot. My mom constantly asked me how other people were feeling or their perceptions and things, which was helpful. But honestly, I don't think race came up that often. And it's interesting because I went to pretty liberal schools. I had some private education. I lived in a racially very diverse city. So it didn't come up that often, which was surprising. And it wasn't really till California. I mean, I heard some very, very racist, blunt things come out. And I still remember being like shocked by it. But I mean, I was like 24, 25. Yeah. And I hadn't really taken this identity thought into that conversation. And I think that's true probably for a lot of people. We're getting some questions in, and we're definitely going to get to them. We're just letting you know. And so I'm just like, I think I'm feeling sad about that because, you know, I think graduate school and some of my professors who really pushed me. I still remember my practice professor, Young. If she's watching, thank you. But really pushing me on a paper, on addressing, looking at many identities, and being like, you need to look at your white privilege. I'm not even feeling like emotional. I'm sharing. It's like that hit me, and I was upset and I was frustrated. And then I learned about a group there that really was like all about focusing on your racism and privilege. It was called Unlearning Racism. That really started, but I was 25. Yeah. Like that's 25 years of what I joke now about. I learned racism for 25 years. And now for the last like 9 years or so, I've been learning how to maybe, you know, break some of that down. And it's hard even here in Boulder. Yeah. So, you know, another reason I greatly appreciate having more conversation. I know when I'm on a tangent, it was just.
It's making me think too about how important it is that we have personal experiences with racism and with different cultures. Yeah. As difficult as that is, I mean, hearing you talk about this, we don't know what we don't know, right? So growing up without an awareness of what you've agreed to, even if it's a subconscious agreement, right?
Socialization.
Socialization. And even for me, it's like, you know, I didn't experience, I think, any overt racism towards me because, you know, in some strange ways I passed, you know, I mean, no one really knew what I was.
Yeah.
I also grew up in a state where, you know, it's mostly people of color. So again, no one really knew what I was. And I think my messaging was a different type of messaging that was more internalized depression, you know. So even like being exposed to racism directly comes as a surprise to me. And that is my privilege, actually. That's my area of privilege, is that it is a surprise when it happens to me. You know, and there are others, including family members, that it's not a surprise to them because it happens all the time. So I have to be aware of myself when I'm in interaction with my community, with others that are, you know, that are experiencing that just because I went through life in a certain way, you know, that I didn't get that directly until later in my life. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, right? Of course it exists. I don't know what I'm trying to say with that. It was there. So, I mean, I think it's again, until you feel it, until it's part of your life, it almost doesn't become real.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I know this next comment might seem, you know, controversial, but I know a lot of the conversations around, you know, white folks doing their work, you know, I get that. But at the same time, it's like, how can you all know unless you've actually directly experienced it, right? How do you know what that feels like unless there's a direct experience? And sometimes that comes through relationship, you know, sometimes that comes through exposure, putting yourself in other places where there are different cultures and different races, making that effort.
Yeah. I think we're getting to one of the questions that someone's asked us: what are our experiences of race? What are our thoughts about that? I think it was asked timely because we just started getting into it.
Yeah.
And you know, as you're sharing about like how race was always there, race was always there, and it makes me think about how one of the best things I heard when I was doing interviews for my thesis was someone discussing their work, anti-racism work, and they were sharing that they were engaging a group about trying to look at race and racism, and that it was mainly a group of white people. They were getting frustrated and mad and you know, attacked back, and they were saying it was as if they were feeling oppressed themselves because there was this awareness of the privilege, and it felt like the privilege should be taken away. Which gets to my more part about my experience of race. I think I didn't think about it for so long, most of my life, and I knew it existed, but I didn't give much thought. Nothing like I do now. And I think because in a way, it you know, there's this white, you know, more dominant. You know, if you look at racism, it's the power aspect. That I didn't see it because everything just worked well. That just seems normal to me. What's you know, you're you know, worried about these things happening possibly or not, and I didn't have any of those. And I think race really became apparent. Really became apparent. I mean, it happened in high school and before that, but I think it really became apparent when I was in California and I was working at what was the best description, but a psychiatric unit for children. And it's only called that because they were given medications. And I noticed a large mass of the population of children were children of color. And, you know, I was a little confused by this. And I remember continuing asking questions like, this doesn't seem like the appropriate mix, like, and wondering more about that. And that's when I first was like, there's something larger going on that I've been hidden from, or I have hidden from. I don't know.
Yeah.
That's why Smith grabbed me. It was like they really forced an anti-racist mission statement. Like, you're going to be looking at this. And I was like, great. And didn't know it was coming for me, but.
Well, that brings up a question for me though, because it's like, again, coming from that place where, you know, my lived experience is this, like every day, right?
Exactly.
What prompted you? What even like woke you up in a sense to like, oh, there's something else going on here. I mean, because my sense is that it's not necessary almost, for a lot of people to want to make that change, to notice even that predominantly children of color are being, are part of this psychiatric service. And, like that noticing, like that level of awareness is not something that can be necessarily, it can be taught in a class, I guess. But I mean, like what woke you up to even noticing that? And then even wanting to work with it.
Even those questions, I'm like, these are great. I should write more. I think at the time, I was still really involved around more white people, and that even though, I think it was just the area that I was in. I was living in Sacramento, California, and it became, I think, what really it became apparent was just the sudden I'd be in my home environment, and I'd be around, maybe a few people of color, but mainly white people. And then I'd go to work, and I'd be surrounded only by children of color, basically. And like, it was an obvious, like, I go from home, I go to work, and there's this huge difference. And here are a whole large mass of people, and I don't believe it's biological. I don't believe that this is because these are families of color or anything like that. And so I wondered, well, how did this happen? And that's, I think, when I first kind of woke up to the realization that, wow, racism is alive and well in a really bad way. And then even after that, I think, believing I was as open-minded as I could be, and that I had the ability to hear other views, and to an extent, yes. And then I think, having that push from my teachers of being like, you're not looking at this enough. Like, you're glancing over something that, as I learned, or at least what I was taught, was like, race is always a huge part of everything. And eventually, I know we'll talk about some of our clinical work with this too, but it's always there. And they're like, look here first. I think when I did some of my research, it was like, they were saying, all these identities, but race is so apparent. It's like, always look at it. And so that push by a teacher, I had this push and pull with her. And that really was a good changing part for me, that I think led me in this direction of really looking at that more. And, and I think it started opening doors of conversations. And the Unlearning Racism group, I can't give enough credit to. They really pushed me to have more conversation. And I felt like I had an environment where people were willing to hear me make really what felt like dumb, racist mistakes, and be like, so great you're sharing this. And, here's
so
some
both being
ideas.
like pushed and also in a place where you could make those mistakes.
And comforted in a way that I was like, I wasn't as scared as maybe I imagine a lot of people are. And so I think that started making me like, look at race. And then the hardest thing is to remember to keep looking at it. Because I can easily, I joke with a circle, I can easily just fall back into my privilege and be like, I don't need to look at this because I'm in the dominant power position.
Which is frustrating for me, I think.
I bet. I'm going to glance at these questions.
And you can see it better than I can.
Right. Beckley addressed them.
More places to make mistakes.
Yes. We'll talk about more places to make mistakes. And I apologize if I didn't get the whole question. It's looking at how we can effectively address these things, I think, in the moment is the question. And how we make mistakes, which is a great question. We're trying to do that in this process now today.
I think, like for me, I think where I come from is just staying really authentic with myself. And it's such a huge internal dialogue because my personality is such that I want to have connection with people. And I think, typical, I think maybe many people of color, that we start off being the educators, of our culture and our race, and all those settings. There's a process that I've gone through with that. And, I was more than happy to do that in my 20s. It also coincided really lovely way with my job. I was a senior policy advisor for Native American Affairs in the Clinton administration, which was pretty cool. So I was the educator. I was the only one in that office that was talking about tribes and working with tribes and constantly educating. and that was fine, but that came at my own expense, right? So after a while, I realized that I needed to be able to be authentic in how I'm sharing myself and my experience. And the only way I know how to do that is when I'm in contact with someone, just really checking in with myself and being honest with myself. It's like, do I want to share this part of me? You know, do I really want to go there with this person? Because the draw had always been, I have to, because if I don't do it, things won't change. Things won't change. You know, people won't learn. That's a huge amount of burden to put on oneself, right? Yeah. So even like in this conversation right here, because, you know, Philip and I work together and we've known each other for a while. Yeah, it may seem like, you know, it's not too charged, but, you know, it is. I mean, my heart is beating, because it's not only like what I'm talking about here, but also just always feeling this responsibility to represent people of color, and in particular Native people, in whatever format I'm in. So in my mind right now, to be honest, it's going through, am I being authentic enough in my Native self? How come I haven't talked about my Brazilian self yet? You know, am I offending people of color? Am I offending social justice work? You know, all of those things kind of keep going through my head. And yet it's like, I still want to be in contact with you. Yeah. So, you know, as a body psychotherapist, you know, what I do with my clients, we just start with the breath, right? So I'm just like, am I breathing right now? You know, I don't know. And also I'm nervous because this is a webinar. So it's like, you know, we're being filmed. So that's being seen in another way is also a little bit, you know, scary.
And we have dual lives.
And we have dual lives. Yeah.
You know, we imagine some of our clients might be watching this too. And we imagine our colleagues who we highly respect too are watching this, or our families. Mm-hmm. And saying that, I feel tense being here. And we talked before this happened about our tension, and we do workshops and we feel better sitting down or as the group facilitator, and the tension went down, but I still feeling like on my seat, like, okay. And this is a hard conversation, and we've talked briefly about how this will look, and knowing that we're bringing up vulnerability. Mm-hmm. And I think, you know, I want to get to this mistake question, and I think it's like more places. Mm-hmm. I think that's the difficult thing, is that there's so much fear, at least for myself, and I imagine for other white people, that they're going to make mistakes, and so we don't even engage the conversation. Like, I'm going to say the wrong thing, or I tried once and I got called out, which I like the term being called in a little more, and it's very different. It's like someone welcoming you, like, hey, I hear you're trying to do this, and you know, when you said that, I think this kind of happened. But I think the mistakes part is one of the things that does stop us a lot, and you know, even with simple things sometimes, because I work with many of my colleagues of color, and like, you know, we're working together with a good friend and colleague, Marseille, who is not in Colorado, but will be here next week. And so I'm constantly thinking, sitting there, I'm the white male of the group. And, you know, I was thinking about just a few weeks ago, Marseille videoed in, because we're doing some discussions for our institute. And I'm sitting there realizing that not only was I taking notes, but I was trying to organize us and get us to go in a direction. And then I was sitting there being like, gosh, how much is my power dynamic playing out right now? And how much, because I'm a white male, and that I'm using those two distinguishing identifiers because they are the big ones in that room, at least in that moment. Like, how much of this playing part? And oh gosh, am I just letting myself take charge? And like, and are they allowing it? And so I started feeling like I was messing up. And I was like, great. And I talked to you about that afterwards. Yeah. And I was like, I feel like I'm doing this, and I don't like that. And,
and I'm glad you did that. Well, I'm glad you did that too, because, you know, I'm checking in with myself too, because my where I come from is like, I'm taking up too much space. Yeah. You know, am I taking up too much space? How much space do I take? You know, there's dueling identity stuff in terms of, you know, Native style of communication, Brazilian style of communication that's always at war with each other. It's like, you know, more quiet versus louder and expressive. So I never am quite sure how I'm showing up in any interaction. And, you know, the thing about making mistakes, you know, in a way, this is sort of an artificial way of trying to like recreate a mistake to happen. It doesn't happen that way. You know, it's like, in a conversation, it'll just happen. And I think in those moments, you know, it's just like checking in, you know, because I'm thinking right now, I'm like, how can we find a place where we can show how that works? It doesn't quite happen. I haven't felt it quite yet. So
No.
it's like, it's those moments where you're like, that didn't feel good, you know, and just saying it, like, that didn't feel good.
Yeah. What did I do there?
Or just even owning it. It's like, that just felt wrong.
It's like the email I sent the other day afterwards. It's like, oh God, what did I just say?
Yeah.
And I said something like, that doesn't sound right. And then we didn't talk about it. So I also felt like something was wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's, you know what, I think that does kind of trigger something in me because, you know, to coin another term, that feels a little bit like white fragility to me, you know, and I'm like, don't be on tiptoes with me. Just don't, you know, just be there. Tell me what you're thinking. Because oftentimes I'm just like, you know, yeah, that was fine. Or if it wasn't, then I would let you know.
Exactly.
So yeah, I think it's that sort of tiptoeing, walking on eggshells thing that makes it difficult for me to connect sometimes. Yeah. You know.
I would think so. Yeah. I think that's a personal nature of my own. A colleague of mine, I was saying this, asked me if I make mistakes. Am I used to making mistakes? And I think, you know, if I was to answer her question now, I'd say, I think I try really hard not to make mistakes. It is about most things in my life. And so I noticed myself making one. And this week I've known I've made like 6 or 7, like in many places. And I felt it. And I felt, you know, crappy about a few of them and just kept moving. Much like this, like I know this is here, that's why I'm sharing it now. And I know things are fine. Yeah. Like that email, no matter how it came off, I'm sure things are fine. Yeah. I'm okay.
I think if it goes unspoken.
Yeah.
You know,
speaking about it.
Yeah. I mean, this is something that I've talked about in trainings in terms of the power of kind of the nonverbal in these interactions, is, you know, if you are holding on to belief systems, both within yourself and others, right? It's going to come through in your nonverbal behavior. It's going to come through in how you hold your body. And I can feel it if somebody's not comfortable with me. I know, you know. What makes it hard is that I don't know if it's because of the way that I look. I don't know if it's because of the space I'm taking up. I don't know any of that until they tell me, right? Or if I ask. So again, it's like, do I feel like I've got the resources enough to ask in this conversation? Do I care enough about this relationship to do it? And that's where I think we're shortchanging ourselves in this effort to really reach across racial divide, is that the assumptions are so powerful and the actions, the nonverbals, are so powerful that we don't even get to the asking. Yeah. Whether it's from the person that is enacting those behaviors or the one that's receiving them, it's like the assumptions are so strong, and it's just like that. For me, the images of the protests and separate groups of people just shouting. There's no dialogue in there because there's no space or even connection. Yeah, it's a lot of pain. That we need to express. We definitely need to express in this country, but there's got to be that second step of where do we actually have this? Where we can slow it down enough to go, you know what, that just hurt like hell, and I just got, you know, I feel pained. Which is interesting. That kind of feeds into an experience I had with a client during an internship experience where they were, you know, in their process talking about what they were talking about and end up using the N-word in my presence. And that impact for me was so somatic, was so in my body, that I literally just put my hand on my heart and I said, that hurt. That was my ability at that moment as a therapist, as a fledgling therapist, to like be in that experience. And their response was, it was almost like shock, like it woke them up in some way. And they're like, actually, that hurts me to say that too. It was so unconscious, you know, and it could have gone a different way. I could have heard it and just held it and had it sit in me and been pained by it. But it was so quick and so just, I keep doing this. It's just so much like this. I had no other way than to say, that hurt. So that was real for me, you know. And that, I think that has to happen more, honestly. I hope that answers some of the questions a little bit.
I think I read one of them is about trying to have a conversation about this with someone who doesn't want to or doesn't want to connect about it. And,
yeah.
I wish I had a great answer for that, because I think I've had these conversations with people of color and with white people, and I find that they're met all kinds of ways. There's never like one great meeting, but I found that, you know, I've had this conversation with white people, and I notice, and I think being a therapist helps us a little bit, because we're able to start noticing what might be coming up. But I've noticed the defensiveness at some point. I remember still in a conversation with a few different people, and the same thing happened, where they were like, don't we feel like we're overdoing this or overblowing it all, or like everyone's just too sensitive?
Yeah.
And I felt irritation, frustration. I noticed those really quick. I was like, okay, that's because where you're wishing this was, and you're having this conversation again. And then I heard beyond that, their frustration and their pain of like, you're taking something away from me.
Yeah.
And so I asked them more about that. I was like, I'm wondering where those words are coming from and what that means for you. Like, and I was trying not to be a therapist as much as I could not be. And I remember one person saying, you know what? That's not even me talking. Like that's my friend, and I've just been hearing this a lot. Or, gosh,
my parents, right?
I guess I'm just feeling hurt by this all too. Or, you know, I'm frustrated because these things are happening to me, or I'm losing my job, or I think I'm going to lose my job because of whatever, immigration, or, and those conversations are always powerful. I had one with one of my best friends who I dearly care about, and I think of as a very open-minded, thoughtful, caring, environmentally focused person. And same kind of thing came up. It's like, well, can't we all just be nice to each other? And I was like, that would be great.
Yeah.
And I was like, and we might need to be able to understand why this keeps being put in place, because there are institutional factors, and we're not getting into all that today, but there are.
Yeah.
We're getting interpersonal. And as I talked to him more and more about it, he became, I think, more and more clear, like why it was frustrating for him that this keeps happening, and why can't we just all get along, as I hear so many times. And those are the conversations I find myself doing most with. I think earlier we talked about how do we work clinically like this?
Yeah.
And like I was saying, my specialization, like I can't just say my specialization is talking with white people who don't want to talk about race. Like,
but you could. I mean, but see, this goes back, I think, to, you know, this is in some ways a very easy conversation to have, and also with all of you, because we're all coming to the table for this, right? So what happens when you're trying to have this conversation with people that are not in the same place, that don't want to hear it necessarily, that are not in a place to hear it? And I'll just say I've been inspired by a couple things that I've seen in the news lately. And
the other day.
Yeah. One is, and I don't know if anyone's seen this yet, but the protests going on in Washington, D.C., which was a pro-Trump protest, that also some Black Lives Matter protesters were present, and they were invited onto the podium to speak to the crowd.
That just, I think, 2 days ago.
Just 2 days ago. And to me, that was such a shift, you know, because there was an acknowledgement that there were differing opinions, that the group, you know, may not hold the same opinion as Black Lives Matter leader that spoke, but that it was this country's, the foundation of this country, that everyone has an opinion, that we have a right to be heard, right? So if you haven't checked out that video, it's really powerful. And I think that there were some shifts, you know, and one of the things that the gentleman who spoke from Black Lives Matter mentioned was that how did he put it? He said there may not have been a change on a grand scale, but on a person-to-person level, he thinks there was. That's where we've got to start, right? So even those conversations with family members or friends, those are the hardest ones. And I have a relative that I know is a Trump supporter, and I'm terrified to sit down with her and talk, because I love her dearly, and I just don't, you know, and I'm sorry to go into politics, but I mean, it's like, I want to bridge that conversation, but I want to do it with love, right?
Well, you're talking about the demonstration more than the political. It's just that there were two ideals that sometimes seem crossed, and the welcoming of this voice, it seemed, that allowed people to connect. I mean, you see in the video, people actually being like, you know, I don't know why we have these differences, and that's a lot of the white people I get to talk to. And you know, when I'm saying that, one thing we've been talking a lot about is Marcia and Marseille and I are doing this institute next week, and we're really focusing on trying to get people to have this conversation and doing it in a therapeutic way.
Yeah.
And one of my roles in that is to be working with the racial affinity group of white people. And so I'm working with a group of white people who want to talk about race and are struggling with it.
Yeah.
And so that's a lot where these conversations come up and trying to do that. And so I think I've seen questions of how do you have that conversation? And for me, as much as it might, like even now I'm like, how are people going to take this? It's me having a lot of compassion, lots of compassion for people, and trying to have that conversation, having compassion for myself, trying to break past the fragility,
right,
and then helping them use that as not a blockade, because the fragility, the guilt, those things in some ways do block us from having more. We just like hide away.
And as a person of color, it's the internalized oppression. I'm telling you, that is the greatest silencer. It's like, oh, it's all me. It's all me. And honestly, moving to Boulder was the first time I've been in a place where I was the only brown person in the room. Most of my life I've been in very multicultural places, and not understanding communication styles, not understanding kind of what was happening in a lot of those rooms. I thought it was just me, and that's a very lonely place to be.
That's very suppression.
Yeah, and that's I think that's what ends up happening is we kind of hold that so tightly inside ourselves. That connection with others becomes very, very difficult. And I remember a teacher of mine, just, African American woman, who kind of translated sort of what was going on for me. And she's like, no, there's some stuff going on in this classroom, and it's not just you. There's a different, racial, cultural dynamic. And I'm like, I had no idea. I thought it was just me. So, okay, so we just got the 5-minute mark.
We have 2 people with us that are helping us with this whole process. So.
And I do want to take a look and see if there are any other questions that we may want to.
I think I've seen some nice comments, and I know there was one about how to talk about with a neighbor and different views. I think building the wall, and I'm hoping some of the things we're sharing are helping. And we might not have a perfect direct answer. It sounds like someone who does not want to have a conversation about it, and that if I'm reading it all correctly. I think that's the only one we haven't really gotten to.
I think that, something that was really useful for me, and this is a former supervisor that did this, you don't have to have words in these conversations, not yet. If something hits you, kind of like what I was talking about before, even just making a sound like, oof, that opens the door to something. We think that we've got to have it all prepared. We have to have the whole speech. It's like, okay, this is what I'm going to say, how I'm going to say it, and sometimes it's just asking the question, like particularly for the neighbor or the family friend. It's like, tell me what you think. What are you feeling about this? And really just, again, staying from your place that if it's okay for you to do that, if you've got enough resources to do that, and you want to be there for that, listening for the things that have more to do with who they are as a person, what they believe, and their story. I think story is super important, and finding connection through that, because all of us have our stories that we want to tell each other, and it gets hijacked by, these huge kind of, institutionalized racism, kind of, those terminology, those become buckets for a lot of pain and a lot of sadness and a lot of fear. So if you can take that big umbrella of what holds all that and just get to the personal, and talk to each other with curiosity and compassion for yourself and for others, it's one place to start.
Yeah. I saw a great last question. Thank you. It was, what's one thing they hope we hope they'll walk away with from this? I know what mine is. And it comes from really why I do a lot of this work, and it's a lot about just the idea of connection and what we're trying to display here. And I'm noticing I could talk to you for another hour or two easily. I have we have 5 more questions.
I know we never even got
to. But we wanted to do this a flow. But I would love it if people walk away with this with an idea that this can be a conversation that can be had.
Yes.
And that people can talk to each other across racial divides about race and possibly make mistakes and not fall into our fragility, but instead welcome the conversation. And so I truly believe that more conversations will allow this to be like a together solution rather than just one of us solution. Which, so I'm hoping, I think that people walk away with a little more emphasis and courage to have conversations about race, even if it's for the white people watching, or if you identify as white, having it with your white friends, talking about it, I think is important. That's a lot of the way I started looking at my own race, was having conversations with a group of white people about our racism and about our privilege, and trying to have these conversations. And it really was impactful and changing in my ability to be more open and understanding of the multitude of identities we all have. So more conversation. I hope we have courage to do that.
Well, and for me, I think my message is really to people who identify as people of color, in-betweeners, like I call myself, to give yourself permission to not have to be the one every time to make this effort, right? And also to turn the lens on yourself and learn about yourself, learn about your identities, learn about your culture and your history. Stop beating ourselves up over not knowing enough, not being enough, not being 100% this or whatever. Stop with the hyphenations, because if we can't bridge our own internal differences, how are we going to do it with others, right? So really finding that place within yourself that you find joy and knowledge, maybe uncover some of those, the things that were never said in your families. And then find that time, and whenever you're ready, to reach across whatever divide you're feeling with someone that you trust.
I think we would just leave also that this work is really valuable to us. We do a lot of free webinars and workshops. We do them nationally and locally, and we are doing. If this interests you and you are local, we are doing a 10-hour conversation on this. An institute that we are charging some money for, and we are definitely helping financially if you need more money. Next week, it's called Reaching Across the Racial Divide. It starts with me, it ends with us. If you want any information about it, please look us up. It's easy to find us on BPS. Send a message to me or to Marcia, and we'd be happy to try and make you able, I guess, financially to come. It would mean a lot. I don't know if you have anything left. I know we're over our time, so.
Thank you all for joining us. We really, really appreciate it. And as hopefully as imperfect as this conversation was, it was perfect in that it happened with all of you, and it's an ongoing effort. And if you have any other questions, we're happy to follow up on them offline as well. Take care.
Thank you all so much.
Thank you.